Frederick Weissman Art Museum, the Walker Art Museum, and on the stage of New York's Carnegie Hall. Other honors include a University of Minnesota College of Liberal Arts Scholar, a Bush Foundation Leadership Fellowship, and induction in 1994 into the University of Minnesota's Alumni Association's Teacher Hall of Fame. Tonight, Dr. Wright's address is called Hurston as High Priestess, Their Eyes and the Hieroglyphs of African American Culture. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Wright.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm almost a little bit worn out from that intro. No wonder I'm so fatigued these days. Goodness. Again, it's my great honor and pleasure to be here for this opening of the Big Read Enterprise. One of the things that the National Endowment for the Humanities does that I think is one of its most effective ways of connecting the world of scholars and creative artists and communities at large. So again, my thanks here again to Evelyn Roloff and to the planning committee for this year's Metropolitan State University Big Read Enterprise. I might say this, for one who has been around the works of Zora Neale Hurston and so many of the major artists of the Harlem Renaissance for so many years, that I oftentimes think I'm beyond being surprised by new perspectives or new bits of information about the era. But in this stage of my life, and when I'm getting much grayer around the gills and consistently longer in the tooth, I've learned that that's not a healthy posture. So cultivating a readiness to be surprised, to see the unexpected, I think is an important part, again, of growing and changing. And so part of what this enterprise here has enabled me to do is to do some rethinking over what sometimes has seemed to be old territory. Just last week in my own classes at the University of Minnesota, where I teach Hurston and the Harlem Renaissance with some regularity, I've been doing seminars for many, many years, I showed a documentary, the very first film documentary on the Harlem Renaissance, which was made by the legendary African-American documentary filmmaker William Reeves, in whose honor a retrospective of his career was done at the Walker Center maybe 7 or 8 years ago. One of his early documentaries was called From These Roots, a review of the Harlem Renaissance, made in 1974. And it's, in part, it uses, again, an amazing aggregation of talent along the way. It's mainly comprised of stills from the photo collection of James Van Der Zee, and the legendary Harlem-based photographer who lived in the Harlem neighborhood for more than half a century and who compiled over the course of his career as a studio photographer and a photographer for the Darby movement and the NAACP and the Urban League and the fraternal orders and so forth, compiled over 100,000 photographs of life in Harlem. What is, as far as we know, the largest single repository of photographic documents on any community in this country. Anyway, this film by Bill Griggs is in part built around James Van Der Zee's still photos, and it has a music score by the legendary stride pianist U.B. Blake, and the narrator is none other than Brock Adams, and it's a marvelous but preliminary film, now some 40 years old. One of my new millennial students in the class asked in the Q&A after, why isn't Zora Neale Hurston discussed in the film? he was indeed correct. And there's no mention of Zora Neale Hurston in the film. And I had to pause for just a moment, and then I tried to explain. It's in part a double-reasoned explanation for this. One, the study of the Harlem Renaissance is much newer, much younger than we sometimes imagine. All right? If you had gone into the University of Minnesota main libraries, or the libraries of any university archive in this part of the country or elsewhere in 1970, in search of materials about a Harlem Renaissance, you would have found a blank. It did not exist. It did not exist. The Harlem Renaissance, as a period of artistic creation and experimentation and political change, so forth, had essentially been forgotten outside the world of the historically black colleges and universities, where during the era of the Renaissance, many of the key principals, those who were scholars, lived and worked, and sometimes died. In part because, as I tried to explain to today's students, American intellectual life, historically, has been as segregated as American social life. Okay? The Harlem Renaissance came into view for modern audiences not because of the work of scholars in the academy, but a book by a self-taught radical theater activist named Harold Cruse, heavily involved with the black theater movement of the 1960s and with Leroy Jones, soon to become Imam Amiri Baraka, and wrestling with the problems of trying to build black theater and a black aesthetic in trying times. And the architects of the black theater movement looked as artists trying to build creative enterprises, any generation, had to find precedents, antecedents, a usable past, as it were. And Cruse had looked back to the teens and the 20s and 1930s. And in that context, in part trying to explain what was it about American culture that made it so difficult to build a vibrant African American theater tradition. He looked back to the era of the Harlem Renaissance and the founding of theaters in, for the most part, the historically black colleges and universities, places like Howard and Atlanta U and so forth. There also was the place where the very first scholarly conference on the Harlem Renaissance was held back in 1955, organized by Sir Sterling Brown, the legendary poet and scholar of the Harlem Renaissance, who grew up and lived on the Howard campus again for the bulk of his adult life, and who put together the first scholarly conference in honor of his colleague, in fact, his office next door mate, philosopher Alain Locke, editor of the Anthology of the New Negro and so forth, who had died the year before in 1954. Outside those circles, again, the Harlem Renaissance simply didn't exist. Harold Cruse's crisis of a Negro intellectual spurred a generation of scholars, most of them involved with the Black Studies movement in the 1960s and early 1970s. So the very first scholarly book on the Harlem Renaissance didn't appear until 1971 by Nathan Huggins, African-American cultural and intellectual historian. Okay? Ultimately, the reason that Hurston didn't appear in William Reeves's film, however, was not just because studying the Harlem Renaissance was so young, but Zora Neale Hurston had not yet been rediscovered in 1974 when the film was made. Hurston, like so many of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance, had been forgotten. She had died penniless, buried in an unmarked grave in Florida. And it was primarily, again, through the efforts of Black Arts era poet, essayist, and novelist Alice Walker, who had become enthralled with Hurston's novel, and their eyes were watching God first and foremost, and tracked down Hurston's unmarked grave, began trying to revitalize her career, to get all of her books out of print back into publication, and who published in 1975 an essay called Looking for Zora, which described the process of her search to discover and recover Zora Neale Hurston. She would later publish a companion essay, and the two of them were again in 1983. They appeared together in Alice Walker's collection, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where, in fact, the concept of womanism was first broached as a black woman's alternative to mainstream white bourgeois Western feminism. So these things all basically came together. It took me, again, a bit to try to explain all this to our new millennial. But I think the light did come on, and William Breeze was forgiven in the process. He himself had done a marvelous other documentary on another major female figure of the Harlem Renaissance era, Madam C.J. Walker, a documentary called $2 in a Dream, which of course is the story of Madam C.J. Walker, originally Sarah Breedlove, starting out with nothing but literally but $2 in a dream and becoming the first self-made woman millionaire of any ethnic background in this country, and who literally created the modern beauty business as we know it in the process, and who herself had become a major patron of the Harlem Renaissance. She was, in the terms of the day, a race woman of the first order. So, with that by way of backdrop for my comments tonight, I want to do something a little out of the ordinary here, which is to, without further ado, lay out for you my basic argument, thesis for this evening's enterprise here. It goes as follows. Although the steadily proliferating scholarship on the Harlem Renaissance and its major artists may make it seem that the field has achieved something approaching full maturity, Zora Neale Hurston's now iconic career and the critical and commercial success of her most famous novel, the chosen focus of this year's Big Read enterprise, belie the reality that our understandings of her work and its multidimensional contexts in the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences remain provisional and preliminary in many respects, and in some regards misguided and myopic. Her place in the interlinking histories of the Harlem Renaissance, of 20th century feminism and womanism, of literary modernism, and of modern cultural anthropology remains fragmentary and uncertain, although the keys to clearer understanding have been staring at us all along in the creative and conceptual paths she pioneered on the road to Their Eyes Were Watching God. Okay? Am I in trouble? All right. Part of what I've learned, again, from the exchange with my new millennial students and with others, again, longer in the tooth, is that today there's a need both for old schoolers and for new millennials to understand Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God in fuller cultural and historical context. So I need to take you on a very brief tour of the history of womanism and black feminism that predates Zora Neale Hurston. A brief survey of the Harlem Renaissance novels and the peer group of male and female African American writers, among whom Hurston now holds so high and honored place. Also, need to point out what remains a seriously understudied subculture of the Harlem Renaissance, that pertaining to Egyptology and Egyptomania, as it would come to be called. And finally, Hurston's own theoretical and creative blueprint for interpreting and reimagining African American culture, history, and traditions. A blueprint framed in her propulsive 1934 essay, The Characteristics of Negro Expression, published originally in the anthology Negro, edited by the wealthy white British steamline heiress Nancy Kennard. Okay? So, that's where we're going to go. So you need to bear with me for a bit. What Zoriel Hurston's erstwhile friend and sometime collaborator Langston Hughes called the Black Renaissance, others called the Negro Renaissance, or the New Negro Movement, or the Negro Awakening, or eventually, and for most of us today, the Harlem Renaissance. Although that term, I also tell students, is a bit of a misnomer. It was never used during the era itself. All these other terms were more common. And scholars and participants like Sterling Brown down in Washington, D.C., from the very outset, rejected the idea that New Yorkers somehow had some monopoly on creativity and cultural and artistic expression. All right? Harlem was, he said, the show till, the cashier's window for an enterprise that was nationwide, and in which older centers of African American culture like Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, and Atlanta, and New Orleans had as much or greater claim as cultural progenitors. At any rate, all these things, I didn't tell you this. The name Harlem Renaissance actually comes from the master's thesis of Melvin Tolson. All right? The very, very important post-Renaissance black poet, who ultimately, in terms of modernist poetics, outpounded Pound in that regard. But he wrote a master's thesis on what he called Harlem Renaissance. Not many people read master's theses, however, so that doesn't explain how the term got so widely into the lexicon. But historian John Hope Franklin, who did read master's theses, and he did read Melvin Tolson's theses, used it for a chapter in his 1946 groundbreaking monograph, From Slavery to Freedom, chapter he called Harlem Renaissance. So John Hope Franklin ultimately bears primarily responsibility for what Sterling Brown considered to be New York chauvinism. But at any rate, all these were names for the first fully self-conscious cultural movement among African Americans, which straddled the years between the end of the Great War, the First Great War, and the bottom of the Great Depression. From a perspective across the color line, but one that nevertheless underscored the cultural impact African Americans had on the times, our migrated St. Paulite F. Scott Fitzgerald called the same era the Jazz Age. In his reminiscences, it was, quote, an age of miracles, it was an age of art, it was an age of excess, and it was an age of satire. One that he believed that in the wake of the failed politics that had produced World War I, echoed in the youthful spirit of what he called the big party, the carnival, and the orgy of the Jazz Age. Well, the Renaissance that African Americans made during the Jazz Age was highly self-conscious, at times obsessively so. It was no less a thing of youth and heat than Fitzgerald's generational orgy, but in the imagination of its new Negro architects, it was a thing that flamed with purposes and portents beyond mere pleasure. It was a candle, a torch, a shooting star, a fiery furnace in the poetry of the day Quote, "We have tomorrow bright before us like a flame. Yesterday a night gone thing, a sundown name. And dawn today, broad arch above the road we came. We march." End quote. In these terms, then 23-year-old migrated Midwesterner Langston Hughes called the youth of Black America to action, to the baptizing fire that poet Claude McKay proposed to, quote, "go naked in, for thus 'tis sweet, into the weird depths of the hottest zone." The purpose behind these things? Transformation. Communal and self-transformation into a shape of flame. The hope for outcome, a stronger soul within a finer frame. As a consequence, we ought not forget that the beginning of the 20s, calls for such a renaissance in African American culture were at least a quarter century old. All right? As were the calls for the, quote, new Negroes who would bring it about. As early as 1895, editorials in African American newspapers had appealed to their readership to begin building a new group personality, a new civilization, and a correspondingly new flowering of art. The much ballyhooed closing years of the 19th century had spawned millennial dreams in African American communities and communities abroad in America. And for many Black Americans, their own special visions were captured in the transformative imagery of Booker T. Washington's and Black clubwoman Fannie Barrier Williams' jointly authored book, A New Negro for a New Century, in 1900. Okay? Zora Neale Hurston was born in Booker T. Washington's Alabama. At the beginning, in 1891 to be precise, of an 1890s decade commonly regarded as the nadir of African American experience, framed by the lynchings, burnings, and mob assaults of a white supremacist reign of terror, and by the Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson sanctions for the new regime of Jim Crow segregation. So the recourse to dreams of African American cultural renaissance revealed both marvelous and tragic dimensions. But in the face of such diversity, nonetheless, African American women leaders in particular emerged as articulate champions and critics of culture, prophesying and promoting a race literature, as they called it, that would vitalize the new century ahead and vindicate an African American self-image under increasing attacks. In the newspapers and novels, dramas and cartoons and poster ads and memorabilia and coon songs and blackface minstrel shows and social Darwinist diatribes of the day. When Zora Hurston was just a year old, one of those women leaders, Anna Julia Cooper, an ex-slave turned scholar, writer, and feminist, in a collection of essays called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South in 1892, found herself, quote, brought to the conclusion that an authentic portrait, at once aesthetic and true to life, presenting the black man as a free American citizen, not the humble slave of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but the man, divinely struggling and aspiring, yet tragically warped and distorted by the adverse winds of circumstance, has not yet been painted, end quote. She went on to say that the canvas awaits the brush of the colored man himself and the colored woman. In this work of the aesthetic sphere, as in the social, she announced, quote, the fundamental agency under God in the regeneration, the retraining of the race, as well as the groundwork and starting point of its progress upward, must be the black woman. In corresponding fashion, in Boston, in 1895, 2 months before Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise oration, Another black woman leader, Victoria Earle Matthews, addressed the first Congress of colored women in the United States on, quote, the value of a race literature, in which she declared, quote, that our history and individuality as a people not only provides material for masterly treatment, but would seem to make a race literature a necessity as an outlet for the unnaturally suppressed inner lives which our people have been compelled to lead. When the foundations of such a literature shall have been properly laid, the benefit to be derived will be at once apparent. There will be a revelation to our people, and it will enlarge our scope, make us better known wherever real, lasting culture exists. For Anna Julia Cooper, for Victoria Earle Matthews, for Fannie Barrier Williams, and other African-American race builders, at the dawn of the new century, the idea of race regeneration or renaissance as a metaphor for cultural change and for an era had dual points of reference that foreshadow Zora Neale Hurston's diasporic outlook. Its implicit cycle of birth and rebirth referred, on the one hand, to a racial first birth in Africa that resounded with the legendary Old World achievements of Egypt, of Ethiopia, of Kush, of Merowe, of India. And on the other hand, referred also to the modern birth and rebirth of the generation-to-generation struggle for the progress of the race in America and throughout the world. All right? So, part of what suggest here in this brief tour here is that the roots of what Alice Walker called womanism, all right, go a long way back, are being articulated with vigor, all right, at the turn of the century, shortly thereafter. In terms of the world of the Harlem Renaissance novelists, with which we link Zora Neale Hurston so rightfully. Hurston's novels, like many of the novels of the Black Renaissance, had also been foreshadowed in pre-Renaissance works, like those of Pauline Hopkins and her Hagar's Daughter, a story of Southern caste prejudice, and her Of One Blood, or The Hidden Self, published during the first 5 years of the 20th century. And closer to Hurston, but ahead of her still, Jessie Fawcett produced the Black Renaissance's first sustained novelistic achievement in the female-centered novel of manners cycle, 7 novels, that centered on the old Philadelphia African-American aristocracy. The first of Fawcett's tales, There Is Confusion, in 1924, related the struggle for success of a middle-class black woman from New York and her troubled love affair with a doctor from an old Philadelphia black bourgeois family. It set the tone for Fawcett's succeeding novels' focus on the complex psychic dilemmas, family relationships, and social philosophies of the new Negro middle class of the 1920s. Like Fawcett's fiction, Nella Larsen's 2 novels, Quicksand in 1928 and Passing in 1930, dramatized upper-class African-American life, but they approached their light-skinned and mixed-race women protagonists as people painfully caught at the borders between respectable African-American society, upper-class European-American society, and rural Southern black folk culture. The spotlights of such novelists cast on the psychic crisis of the middle class, however, was not the tendency that drew the most attention to the novelists of the Black Renaissance. Controversy centered rather on the opposing tendency towards strongly anti-bourgeois identifications with the sensationalized vitality, exoticism, and presumed primitiveness of the new urban black underclass. Claude McKay became the Renaissance's representative figure in this respect. His unrepentantly primitivistic Home to Harlem in 1928, critic Sterling Brown would later comment, had a, quote, sort of ribald poetry rooted in the setting of Harlem's speakeasies and buffet flats and railroad dining cars. In Banjo, 1929, McKay's fusion of primitivism and the picaresque produced a highly dramatic confrontation between instinct and intellect, and central characters set among a roving band of Afro-Caribbean, African, and African-American beach boys across the Atlantic in Marseille. And here, the exaltation of the instinctual life over the intellectual in McKay's fiction and as the work of other Renaissance writers characteristically drew its emotional power from the frenetic, highly stylized new popular culture of African-American blues, jazz, dance, and vernacular language that came to symbolize the Roaring Twenties. Rudolph Fisher's pioneering social comedy, The Walls of Jericho in 1928, for example, worked the language of Harlem jive into a skillful satiric tool for dissecting the shared black and white fascination for Harlem's low life and high life. And Fisher's detective novel, The Conjure Man Dies, in 1932, the first period's first full-length detective story, converted Harlem's culture of pool parlors and cabarets, African mysticism and voodoo into functional elements of intrigue as mysterious as the murders they concealed. The contemporary African-American life in general, and the Black Renaissance in particular, could be the objects of full-blown novelistic satire, became comically clear to others of Hurston's peers in later books such as George Schuyler's Black No More in 1931, and her close friend Wallace Thurman's The Blacker the Berry in 1929, and Thurman's Infants of the Spring in 1932. Hurston had teamed with Langston Hughes and Wallace Thurman to create the short-lived literary periodical, risque experimental literary periodical Fire. At any rate, Schuyler's Black No More turned the new popular literature of science fiction fantasy to the purpose of satirizing race relations in all their political, social, psychological, and sexual manifestations. All right? If you're not familiar with Schuyler's book, a black scientific genius, one Dr. Junius Crookman, invents a system of electrical nutritional glandular control that turns black people, hair, features, physiognomy, and all, into whites, and subsequently turns the social order topsy-turvy as the discovery's unforeseen consequences work themselves out, all their collateral damage. Thurman's satire of intraracial color prejudice, The Blacker the Berry, a line drawn from W.C. Handy's classic St. Louis Blues, was more caustic than comic and ultimately resolved this kind of painful subject matter not through ridicule but through the heroine's deep self-revelation. And Infants of the Spring, Thurman's biting critique of the Harlem Renaissance literary world, raised the specter of disillusionment and a damning parody of the movement in eclipse its brightest talents at wit's end. But the movement's highly romantic beginnings would eventually come to a satiric end is not surprising. It's a common course for the little renaissances that dot the cultural history of the modern world. But perhaps a better sense of the resources still available to Renaissance writers when Harlem was no longer in vogue and its glitter less beguiling comes from the novels set in times and landscapes outside the Negro Mecca. Closer to the fictional worlds that Hurston would create, Langston Hughes's blues-toned Not Without Laughter in 1930, for example, inhabited a small Kansas town drawn from out of Hughes's autobiographical past, in which a deeply religious and folk-wise mother contends with the conflicting secular values of three very worldly daughters, and the efforts of one daughter's son, through whose eyes the family's conflicts are seen, to find his way in a troubled world. Like Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston had imaginative reserves outside of Harlem. And in Jonas Gordvine, her first novel in 1934, and then In Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937, both set in her native Florida, in largely self-contained, all-black rural communities, Hurston explored more fully than any other novelist of the Harlem Renaissance the rich texture of the African-American Southern folk life, whose migrant emissaries had made the 20s cultural explosion possible and given it ancestral roots to which the artists of the Renaissance in times of adversity could return. As significant as the discovery of ancestral Africa was to the Black Renaissance, even more central were themes of the city discovered and the American South rediscovered. The Renaissance, scholarly consensus today remains, was primarily an urban movement and an increasingly urban civilization. And when its artists employed Africa or the American South, the tendency was to use them as pastoral landscapes, as essentially remote settings dreamily seen. When the Renaissance artists present the familiar, most often it's the metropolis, ideally the black metropolis, the black Mecca, I recall. Its sophistication, its crush and chaos of racial and social types and mores, its cosmopolitan mix of language and vernacular types and music. But Black Renaissance writers who were Southerners, or to whom the South was familiar, rediscovered it as a place of beauty, strength, vitality, violence, and tradition. In Gene Toomer's Georgia landscapes from Kane, in Zora Neale Hurston's Florida and Louisiana fiction and folklore, to an extent in Sterling Brown's Southern Road, the folk roots of Southern Black life are celebrated and explored, sometimes with respect to survival of African tradition and the practices and beliefs of Southern Black folk, and sometimes with respect to the conflict in the South between destructive urban forces and the communal vitality of rural folkways. All right. Turn now to a brief look here at the world of social science, of anthropology, and folklore studies. It's also so much a part of Hurston's world, and the world of the riser watching God. Zora Neale Hurston and Sterling Brown, in particular amongst the writers I just alluded to, in particular draw attention to another facet of the Black Renaissance, that despite all the psychic force of the migration northward to the cities of refuge, pulled the consciousness of new Negro artists and thinkers steadily south. After a war decade remarkable for accumulating major folklore collections in America, the 1920s and early 30s became an era remarkable for publishing folklore, among which collections of African American Southern lore and traditions loom large. In 1922, Fisk University professor Thomas Talley published a large collection of play songs and proverbs and verbal art, a book called Negro Folk Rhymes. Ambrose Gonzalez presented a group of coastal Sea Island, Georgia, and Carolina fables told in Gullah or Geechee dialect, right? In a book called With Aesop Along the Black Border. The dense population of African Americans in the Black Belt region of the Old South had created the richest oral tradition in American English, especially in the Sea Island region of Georgia and the Carolinas. And where Gullah or Geechee, that is basically a creolized amalgam of West African and European and Native American language and lore survived. Elsie Parsons published materials from the region, tales, songs, and anecdotes, in a book called Folklore of the Sea Islands in 1923. And an African musicologist and composer from Sierra Leone, Nicholas Volanta Taylor, came to the region to study the links between African American and African music, transcribing his collection of St. Helena Island spirituals in 1925, the same year that Locke's New Negro appeared in the process. James Weldon Johnson, so prolific in so many ways, contributed to the spreading fascination with Southern Black religious music by editing his Book of American Negro Spirituals in 1925 and the second book in 1926. And the growing interest in African American secular songs and blues, and ballads, work songs, and shouts led Howard Odom and Guy Johnson, a white social scientist, to publish pioneering studies of the Negro and his songs and Negro workaday songs also in 1925 and 1926. things. So all these create a richer, much more complex context, again, for thinking about Hurston's career and work that we sometimes bring to these matters. Groups of African American scholars and students have been working actively to document and preserve African American folk traditions since the 1880s and 90s, when a black folklore group formed at Hampton Institute in Virginia. In the 1920s and 30s, a group of professionally trained black folklorists emerged to define the field. Hurston was not alone. Arthur Huff Fawcett, brother to Jesse, specialized in the folk narratives and riddles of the South, the West Indies, and urban Philadelphia, and contributed essays and articles and stories regularly to Opportunity Magazine, The Crisis, Black Opals, and other little black journals of the period. James Mason Brewer, a Texas-based black folklorist who had studied at Indiana University with folktale specialist Stiff Thompson, published a groundbreaking slave collection called Juneteenth. And subsequent volumes of South Carolina humor and tales and preacher and ghost stories from the Texas Brazos region. Finally, Zornie Hurston, trained in anthropology at Columbia University under Franz Boas, one of the leading figures in modern cultural anthropology, fused her ongoing folklore collecting and research with a developing career as a creative writer that led to a series of works on African American hoodoo, Jamaican obeah, Haitian vodun, and on to the Southern songs and jokes and games and tales and conjure lore in her classic Bugles and Men in 1935, 2 years before The Rise We're Watching God was published. Much of the popular culture and high art of the Black Renaissance, from dance crazes like the Charleston and the Black Bottom to the avant-garde experimentalism of Gene Toomer's Cane, and composer William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony, and Aaron Douglas's Aspects of Negro Life murals were built on the aesthetic foundation of this huge repository of Southern black folk tradition to which Hurston made such central contributions. And when the vogue for Harlem declined after the crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, and the artists of the Black Renaissance had to reckon the extent to which they, in Alain Locke's terms, had, quote, gone jazz mad and cabaret crazy, instead of becoming folk wise and sociologically sober, they could turn, as young Richard Wright would, in his new mid-30s Blueprint for Negro Writing, to this body of tradition, massive and vital, to try to discover again the channels through which the racial wisdom flowed, his phrase, and through which the Black Renaissance, or a movement that might supplant it, could renew itself. Well, at this point, as an appropriate juncture for sharpening our focus on the layered conceptual and creative dynamics that frame The Rise We're Watching God and that deserve more scrutiny than they customarily receive. Richard Wright's Blueprint for Negro Writing, published in 1937, just a few months apart from Hurston's The Rise We're Watching God, published in the leftist journal New Challenge, comprised a manifesto against what Wright called the so-called Harlem School. There were the writers to whom his friend Langston Hughes had summoned a decade earlier in his famous essay in The Nation, the Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. And with Wright leading the intellectual charge against what he considered to be a fantasy era of pleading with and curtsying to white audiences, Wright outlined a Marxian ideological framework of theme and perspective and Marxian literary aesthetics that theoretically at least would replace not just the literary text of the Harlem School, but what he called the archaic morphology of Christian salvation as well. All right? And he called on what would be a new secular priesthood of writers who would instead do no less than create the values by which their race is to struggle, live, and die. With himself, presumably, as high priest. Okay. 3 years before Wright's blueprint, however, Hurston published her own theoretical blueprint for African American art and culture. More interpretive than an ideological one. An essay, again, the essay, The Characteristics of Negro Expression. There, she theorized that a performative sense of human life as drama and a will to adorn were the primary cultural motives at work in African American culture, coupled with customary uses of language that were decisively hieroglyphic, she said. Not bad English, but insistently visualized, highly dramatized, dynamic and innovative linguistic strategies that adaptively employed metaphor and similes, and she offered an array of examples of these things, double descriptives, verbal nouns, and along with various forms of what she called action words, and aesthetic principles of asymmetry, angularity, and mimicry that extended into dance forms, into song styles like the blues, and into cultural spaces like the Germinal juke joint, which Hurston said was really the birthplace of the blues and so much black vernacular culture. Undauntedly primitivist in her language at this point, and essentialistic, Hurston contended, quote, that the white man thinks in a written language and the Negro thinks in hieroglyphics. Although the continuities between her hieroglyphic theories and 19th century Ralph Waldo Emerson's pictorial transcendentalist poetics during the American Renaissance might suggest a non-racial angle of reference in that regard. Well, here's a bit of local connection to enlarge the province of Zora Neale Hurston's world and work at this point in time. From April to September of 1936, Zora Neale Hurston was in Jamaica pursuing her research on Obeah with the support of a Guggenheim Fellowship. She was doing fieldwork. Fieldwork was something new in cultural anthropology at this point in time, and her mentor, Papa Franz Boas at Columbia, was one of the pioneers of modern anthropological fieldwork. At any rate, Hurston was in Jamaica on a Guggenheim. From September of 1936 to March of 1937, she had shifted the scene of her research to Haiti, where she was, again, absorbed in studying Haitian traditions and Vodou in particular. There in Haiti, in 7 weeks, she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God. There in Haiti, in 7 weeks. On March 11 of 1937, within a week of returning to the United States, Zora Neale Hurston appeared at Northrop Auditorium on the University of Minnesota campus for a convocation. Part of a series of convocations involving Harlem Renaissance artists and performers that were originally engineered by this dynamic leader of North Minneapolis' Phyllis Wheatley House, W. Gertrude Brown, who had connections all across the country, a dynamic presence, and who at a time when black artists would come to the Twin Cities, Ellington, Robeson, Marinens, and could not stay in local hotels, and had to use backdoor elevators and so forth, Gertrude Brown worked out an arrangement whereby such artists would be housed instead at the Phyllis Wheatley House. and the concert halls or academy places where they came would be paying their travel and freight and honorariums. But the artists would contribute performances, readings, recitals at the Phyllis Wheatley. It was a dynamic space. Zora Neale Hurston came to convocation at Northrop Auditorium, again on March 11, 1937. And the archival account I've pulled from the University microfilm reads as follows. Convocation today hears Zora Hurston. Lecturer will interpret Negro folklore in Northrop Talk. Received fellowship from Barnard to conduct study of race. Zora Neale Hurston, Negro writer and lecturer, will interpret Negro folklore when she talks about music on the Black Keys at Convocation in Northrop Auditorium at 11:30 a.m. today. Ms. Hurston was born in Eatonville, Florida, and was educated at Morgan Academy, Baltimore, at Howard University in Washington, and Barnard College for Women in New York City. The latter school she studied anthropology under Dr. Franz Boas and was graduated in 1927. Upon her graduation from college, Ms. Hurston received a fellowship from Barnard to collect Negro folklore. She spent 3 years collecting folklore of the Southern Negro and has one of the most complete collections in that field. In the winter of 1932, Ms. Hurston directed a troupe that presented a program of Negro spirituals and work songs at the John Golden Theater in New York City. Later in May of 1934, she exhibited her troupe at the National Folklore Festival in St. Louis. She's the author of 2 books, Mules and Men and Jonas Gourdvine. In 1936, Ms. Hurston received a Guggenheim Fellowship to conduct research in the West Indies for a new book. Her discussion today, Music on the Black Keys, will center on the imagery in Negro and religious poetry, and drama and adornment in Negro folklore, and rhythm in Negro poetry and music. She will interpret her discussion by singing and chanting the songs. Okay? Performed and sung back then before an intrigued but not fully comprehending Minnesota audience. Hurston's hieroglyphic theories of culture and language evoke inevitably the exotic apparatus and discourses of Egyptology and decipherment that pervaded the intertwined worlds of scientific archaeology and popular Egyptomania that captivated audiences worldwide during the 1920s and 30s in the wake of the 1922 discovery of the tomb of the Egyptian boy pharaoh Tutankhamun. And that in African American communities especially fueled the engines both of African ancestralism and racial renaissance. Though our current scholarship on the Harlem Renaissance remains woefully inadequate in this regard, startlingly enough, none of what are now many Harlem Renaissance referenced encyclopedias and historical dictionaries contains a single entry on the archaeology, the Egyptology, the Tutmania of the era. Though the obvious influences of Art Deco, visual styles, architecture, book and magazine covers and illustrations, popular song themes, music, movie spectacles, and pulp fiction abound. Madam C.J. Walker, who I alluded to earlier, based her beauty business in Indianapolis, Indiana, where she built a modern center in the shape of a flat iron, the triangular shape of a flat iron, to house her production line for producing beauty products for black women, along with offices for black professionals, for doctors and dentists and opticians and lawyers and so forth, along with a spectacular theater in Egyptian Art Deco style. All the appurtenances. W.E.B. Du Bois, his work is riddled, again, with Egyptological references and allusions. All right? The riddle of the Sphinx, most often amongst them, so forth. All right? And Arthur Schomburg's most famous essay, published in Locke's The New Negro in 1925, called "The Negro Digs Up His Past," makes the archaeological motif explicit. Makes it explicit. And Locke himself was present in Egypt at Luxor in 1923 for the grand opening of the temple, and published an essay, "The Impressions of Luxor," in the Howard University Alumni Magazine, while Hurston was at Howard working with Locke and Stylus. So she clearly knew this whole world before she went to Barnard and to Columbia. Okay? But unfortunately, again, such matters are barely registered in our scholarship on the Renaissance and on Hurston. I'm trying to be conscious here of the ticking of the clock, and I'll try to move to a close in this regard. Hurston's eyes were watching God, even as it is routinely studied and lesson planned as a consummate local color or dialect novel, as a feminist or womanist Bildungsroman, or story of womanly rites of passage, or whether it's seen as a pioneering African-American love story. All of these quite valid. But the novel is rarely approached on Hurston's own hieroglyphic terms as a self-consciously modernist manifestation of an African-American deployment of the same mythic method or mythopoetic method associated with such classics of high literary modernism as James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land and the like. Works whose larger architecture creates and sustains some kind of continuous parallel between the world of modern daily life, as Joyce's Ulysses does, and tracking, again, our hero Bloom's daily life in Dublin against the background of Homer's Odyssey and the ancient Ulysses. Some kind of continuous parallel between the world of modern daily life and the cosmological and mythological structures of ancient civilizations. And unfortunately now, although scholarship on Hurston is approaching 40 years old, this facet of Hurston's work and of her most successful novel remains basically unexplored. Few exceptions. John Lowe, author of a book I heartily recommend called Jump at the Sun, Zora Neale Hurston's Cosmic Comedy, offers a welcome exception in this regard when he writes, "Janie intends her tale told to Phoebe to function like T-Kate's bundle of seeds. T-Kate's seeds and their link with the sprouting of the story itself are part of the network of Egyptian symbolism that pervades the novel. T-Kate is buried like a pharaoh," Lowe tells us, "with a guitar in his hand." It's a phallic symbol. He's repeatedly described as son of the evening sun, an avatar of Osiris. And the circumstances of his death associated with flood, akin to the flooding of the Nile Delta and the periodic inundations of the Nile, around which Egyptian myth and cosmogony revolve. He resembles, in multiple ways, the Egyptian black god of fertility, ruler of the lower world, whose symbol is an eye open wide as a sign of his restoration to light by Isis, his wife and sister. More than a century and a half ago, in American writing, in 1855, amid the rising sectional tensions between the North and the South over slavery, and amid xenophobic nativist outcries against the flood of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and other parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, Walt Whitman wrestled with his own uncertainties about slavery and the influx of aliens, and meditated on a on collections of etchings of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and tomb carvings that he saw in the New York Library. And he composed a poem of wonder at the resurrection of the wheat, later called This Compost, inspired by the story of Osiris and Set. Osiris, as we know, was the mythical god king who ruled Egypt in ancient times. His brother Set, jealous of his power, killed Osiris by trapping him in a marvelously ornamented coffin and floating it down the Nile. Isis, who was both Osiris' sister and wife, retrieved the body of Osiris and brought it back to Egypt. Set found it again, however, and tearing it apart, scattered the limbs of Osiris across the land. In some versions of the myth, Isis searched them out, gathered the limbs, put the body back together, and then lay with her husband to bring him back to life. In other versions, Isis took the form of a bird and flew over the earth seeking Osiris' body. When she found it, she beat her wings so that they glowed with light and stirred up a wind. And Osiris revived enough to make love with her and to beget their child, Horus. It's a story of envy and violence, of dismemberment and reunification, of death and loving renewal. And Osiris, god king of Kemet, or Egypt, the Black Land, is typically painted not black, or brown, or red, or yellow, or white, but green, the color of blooming vegetation. Osiris thereby represents the evergreen principle in nature, the gift of the gods to human beings. He stands for what is broken, dismembered, and decayed, yet returns to life with procreative power. His body is not just reassembled, it comes back green. Whitman's strife-born poem returns us with Osiris to the mystery of how sweet things can be made to grow out of corrupt and decaying bodies. Like Whitman, Zora Neale Hurston found in the Egyptian mythopoetic cycle of Osiris and Isis a new framework for reimagining African American life in the 20th century and for revitalizing it spiritually, cosmologically, erotically. All right? It's the gift that makes her the High Priestess of the Black Renaissance. Thank you.